Hi there, I hope you're having a great day so far. But there's no doubt that the world is going through a really challenging time at the moment. But through the most difficult times in our lives, we experience growth, whether we like it or not. And the reason for this is that we have to adapt to new situations and scenarios that we hadn't before. And in order to get through these tough times, and when the world as we know it has changed around us, sometimes and invariably we have to change something within us. And although that we try to protect our children from all of these outside changes, we can also use them as a great opportunity to teach our children valuable life lessons. So our current situation is a perfect example of this. And lucky for us today, we are joined by Zanni Louise, who's going to talk through a few of these valuable life lessons that we can actually choose to teach our kids. Now, Zanni Louise is the author of 12 children books and the author of the Humankind series. Zanni's books are sold internationally and have been long listed in the CBCA Awards. Now, she tours Australia, she visits schools, festivals, and runs a whole heap of workshops for adults, and we're really, really grateful for her time. Thank you for joining us, Zanni. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Yes, once again, we're really, really honoured. And really, at the moment, with everything that we're going through, and as I've just said in my introduction, if there ever was a time to teach kids some lifelong lessons, it would be now. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, definitely. And I guess to help kids cope and be resilient in times of difficulty, we want them to feel secure, we want them to feel safe, and I guess we want them to have a strong sense of themselves. So that's what my series Humankind is all about. It's all about helping kids understand who they are, not just for themselves, but also in relation to other people, so their friends and their family and their society at large. And what I think underpins all of that is values. So we talk about values like honesty and integrity and things like that. They're kind of abstract words that are thrown around, and I know they're used a lot in education. A lot of primary schools and preschools run their education program based on values rather than achievement outcomes. But I really wanted to understand what those particular values were. You know, what is honesty? What is persistence? And really think about it in relation to children. So I think it is really important to build connections with our children, and also to give them tools for understanding who they are and, you know, how the society works, I suppose. And now is a really good time for that, because A, we've got the time to spend with our children, but B, we also want our kids to feel safe, resilient and secure.
Yeah. And I mean, we're going to speak through the details individually of what these values are, and the important messages that they teach. But in saying that, I mean, I'd love to be able to know from your perspective. I know that when you were developing this series, you spoke to children directly. What did you learn from them when you got to sort of interview and speak to them?
So it was a really interesting process, because when I first sat down to write these books, I thought, well, I know what honesty means to me. And actually, the more I thought about it, the more kind of confused I became, because I thought, well, sometimes you're honest in this situation, but not in this situation. And, you know, it's a really complex sort of idea. So what I thought I'd do was I'd go into a primary school and ask the kids and see what light they could shed on the values, because I know they talk about them in schools. But what I wasn't prepared for was by me just simply sitting there and asking a big group of kids who were ages 6 up until 12, I asked them, what do you guys think honesty is? Was that they just had this absolute urgency to talk about these things and share. And they were all sitting up high on their knees and all had their hands outstretched. And they were talking about, I suppose, specific examples of the times in their life when they had to be honest, or maybe a time where they were initially dishonest, but then they changed their mind and they decided to be honest. And they were talking about why they changed their mind. And a lot of that was to do with how they felt. So, for example, when you tell a little lie, you feel uncomfortable in your tummy and you feel guilty about the other person maybe, or you feel worried you're going to get in trouble. So there were lots of these things which I hadn't really thought about, but kids really think about it. And as soon as you ask them the questions, they switch on and they all want to really talk about it. So that experience really made me realize, I guess, how important it was to write this series of books, but also how to write it. What I wanted to do was to capture their voices and to capture their experiences and use a cast of characters to be able to do that. So in the book, there are 5 characters and they're kids, and they basically share different aspects of honesty or persistence, and they talk about how it relates to their own life in actual real examples, like learning to ride a bike or something like that.
And teaching kids values is something that I wish that I had when I was growing up, because there was lots of things maybe in the school curriculum and or from from my parents and my grandparents were never really taught it of and had a title on what values were and those types of things. And you mentioned earlier before about it gives children a really good sense of self, which is something that, to tell you the truth, I've only really started to work on within myself, is sharing something very personal at the moment, but from it showing and understanding what empathy is and understanding, well, this is me and this is how other people feel in this scenario. So to be able to teach kids at such a young age, to be able to have that sense of self is an incredible life lesson and virtue to be able to have. But, because, and as you mentioned before, it is actually in the curriculum. So how do parents, when maybe they haven't had the lessons taught to them as well about what values actually are, how can a parent then go and speak to their children about what values are, and how do they have those conversations?
Well, what we've produced is a couple of books to start with. So these are the books. So the books start off with little stories. So these are the characters that I mentioned earlier, and each scenario relates to a different aspect of the value. But right at the end, we actually throw the question back to the kids. So at the very end, the last bit of the story is, can you think of a time you were persistent? So it puts the question back to the children who are reading the book. We also share some anecdotes from adults in the community. So these adults are all, people like a paramedic or a school teacher or a scientist, and they're all people who have shared quite honestly about their own experience in relation to the values. And I thought that was a really nice way of, I suppose, normalizing the values and also normalizing growth, because you talked earlier about growth. And I think that's really what values come back to, is that, it's about personal growth and, learning to be a better person, I suppose. But for kids to see that adults are also on that journey, to me, that's important, because, adults aren't perfect either, are they? But also right at the very end, we've got some actual resources for parents. So these have been developed by a child and adolescent clinical psychologist called Amika Johnson. And she has basically put together some questions that parents can ask their kids. For example, how did you feel when you made a mistake? Like, how did it feel in your body? So she actually breaks it down. She talks about the importance of the value in relation to the child, into relation to the child's place in society and family, all of those sort of things. And she also gives you practical questions you can ask your child, or topics for conversation. So we make it as easy as possible. And we also have some teacher resources. So they're available on my website. But they're really useful too, because they also break it down and they make it really practical for parents and teachers to help kids engage with the books, but also beyond the books. So they're actually having conversations.
So this may also at the same time be a lesson for us adults as we are teaching the kids too, and having those moments of empathizing and internalizing certain situations as well as we're speaking to the kids, which I think is absolutely brilliant. And it's usually only in really, as I said earlier on, in difficult times in life that you learn these big life lessons, but it is an opportunity to come out the other end of all of this COVID madness and acquired something really incredible. Now, I've got a whole heap of questions that I just wanted to shoot through just now with you. First one is, why do you think that connectedness is more important than ever at the moment?
Well, yeah, I suppose definitely. And it comes back to that idea that we want our kids to feel safe and secure. And connection's a really big part of that. And I know in my household, the kids are overhearing the television and the news, and they're hearing the adults talking about quite sort of stressful things, I suppose. And for a child to kind of get their head around that, I guess you want to give them tools to feel resilient and feel safe in their own experience. So I think connection's a really big part of that. And I invite my kids to tell me how they're feeling. For example, my daughter felt really confused at the beginning, oh, schools are shutting and I can't see my friends. And, she's really anxious about it. But she really talked about how she felt in her tummy and what the actual experience was like for her. And I talked about what it was like for me. Like, I was quite honest about, well, I'm actually feeling really stressed and I'm feeling really concerned about my career. And, I was able to, the more I articulated that, in a safe and reasonable way, the stronger our connection became, and the more she was able to deal with her own stress around all of these events. And I guess it's helped us as a little family unit negotiate, what's going on at the moment and cope as best we can.
Yeah. And the book also talks about honesty. Could you tell us a little bit more about, just briefly, what it actually talks about? And do you have any tips for parents how they can actually teach their kids the virtue of honesty?
Because honesty is a really complicated one. It's the one I started with. And like I said earlier, the more I looked into it and thought about it, the more kind of fractured I felt about it, because I was thinking, and I talked to my daughter about this, who, by the way, is 10 now. And I asked her, well, what do you think about honesty? And one of the first things she said to me was, yeah, but sometimes your best friend might tell you a secret and they trust that you're not going to tell anyone, but is that honesty or is that not honesty? So I guess it's one of those black and white things, gray areas, because there's also that time when a child develops theory of mind and they start to tell little fibs. And they might tell you just a little white lie sort of thing. But that's a positive developmental stage for them, because they're starting to understand that you have a different mind to them. And then, because I'm in the world I'm a writer, so I'm very concerned about imagination, and I call myself an imagination agent, so for me, imagination is really important. And of course, that's not based on truth necessarily, or very rarely. So it was a really complex one to tease out, but I thought what it came back to, and this is what Amika, the clinical psychologist, helped me realize, was that what it came back to was that the virtue of honesty in the context that we're talking about at the moment, which is who are we in relation to ourselves, who are we in relation to the world and our society, is that honesty helps us. It helps other people understand how we feel. That's one example. So when, like in the case of COVID-19, when I talk about feeling stressed and what that feels like in my body, that helps other people understand me, help me, and also help them, because that gives them a permission to talk honestly about how they feel. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect of honesty. And also it helps us feel closer to each other and more connected, which you were talking about earlier. So I guess it helps us feel safe and helps other people help us if we need it, but it helps us help other people, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So it's socially bonding when we're honest and when we're vulnerable. And honesty and trustworthiness sort of sit side by side and sometimes overlap a little bit. So
Yep.
they're, yeah, interesting things to talk about, and that's why we've written the books. I've written the books as I've written them, is that they're more conversation starters rather than the be all and end all. Like, it's not me sitting on a pedestal teaching kids how to be honest. I'm not interested in that, and I'm not that person, because I'm not, you know, a person who can do that, qualified to do that. But what I can do is I can create stories, and I can allow the kids to step inside that story and experience, I suppose, or help them engage with those questions themselves.
Yep. And the book also lists tips for nurturing persistence in children. Could you just quickly just talk through what they are?
So I think, once again, it's just helping kids focus on the fact that, well, you need to practice. Things don't happen automatically. Not being afraid of mistakes, so that mistakes are a really important part of growth. Thinking about asking the child, how did you feel when you were learning? Putting the emphasis back on the experience of learning rather than the achievement, because that's, you know, it's the journey rather than the destination, which is really important when we're thinking about persistence. And also, what did you do when you made a mistake? You know, so I guess normalizing the mistake and making kids realize that it's okay to make mistakes, and mistakes are part of that growing experience. Maybe you want to ask, you know, did someone help you, or what help was available to you? Because of course that helps us, you know, on our path to wherever we're trying to get to. And thinking about, how did you feel when you finished? So for example, if a child is learning to read, and that might be a bit of struggle for them, maybe you could go back to a time where they did succeed with something like tying their shoelaces, and focusing on the end outcome and how that actually felt can remind the child why it's important to go on that journey in the first place. Because at the time when you're struggling, you can easily forget that journey. You know, you can easily forget what the end goal, or the purpose of the end goal. So it helps kids to kind of keep on that path, I suppose, and be persistent.
Yep. And talking about paths, I mean, with parents actually sort of, you know, going down the path of teaching their children these values now, how, in your opinion, how honest do you think we should be with our kids about everything that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, the news is on a lot, you know, in the background, you know, so kids are really picking it up, whether you know, unless you completely shelter them from it, I suppose. So I know my kids at least are very aware that things are happening, and they also know, of course, that they can't go to school, and they know they have to stand 1.5 meters away from people in public and things like that. They can't see their friends. So I think it's important to maintain that connection and speak honestly. You obviously don't need to go into the hardcore details, maybe about, you know, statistics and how many people have died and things like that. Maybe that's too much information, or maybe it's too traumatizing. But I suppose being honest about the things that the child has within their control, you know, so I suppose explaining why we have these rules in place at the moment, the purpose of them for a broader society. And again, going back to that, keeping that connection strong, how do you feel? And how do I feel as an adult? And some adults I know possibly protect their kids from that, you know, from how they actually feel, because they want their kids to know that, well, I'm a nice strong adult and I'm here to look after you and you don't have to worry. But I find that by being a little bit vulnerable and by being really honest about my experiences, that really helps my kids understand me, but helps strengthen our connections, and also helps inspire them to be honest about how they feel. And that can help us all in turn. So for example, if I'm losing my temper really, you know, a little bit more often than usual because of the situation, I can talk about why that is, and I can talk about how I'm actually feeling, and that can help us all.
Yeah. And last thing I just wanted to ask you is, how can we walk away from this interview today and build human connections at this time, which is really, really important, given that we're all home in isolation?
Definitely. Well, a couple of things. Read to your kids. Books help your child develop empathy and to step inside another character's shoes for just a moment, gives them an experience of escapism perhaps, but also gives them experience of empathy, and all of those, empathy is one of those binding and connectedness tools we need in society. And it also, that close contact with each other is really helpful for kids and adults, I think, at the moment. So if you've got a child at home, sit down together, spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes or more reading together. Also talking about the themes of the book. So my books are deliberately designed that you can talk about them. So if you are purchasing the Humankind books and you're reading them with your children, engage with the resources at the end, ask the kids questions, encourage the kids to ask you questions. And actually what I've discovered by the early readers of these books is that the parents tell me that they were really surprised because they actually sat down and talked for a whole hour with their kids after this about honesty, and they started to think for themselves, hang on a second, what is honesty, or what is persistence, and why is it important? And like me, when I started writing these books, I hadn't really thought about it in so much depth. So I think it's a really good opportunity to engage in a really rich and detailed way with your children. And one last thing I'd say is that I've started a connection challenge on Instagram and social media and Facebook group, which is basically 30 different tasks you can do with your kids at home. They're all isolation friendly, so they're all things you can do at home. They're all relatively easy, but they're all about strengthening those connections in our family unit, but also beyond our family unit. Even though we can't physically see each other at the moment, we can still maintain those strong connections with our friends and beyond.
Oh, wonderful tips and advice today. Thank you so much for your time. As I said, really, really grateful. If parents have got any other questions, whereabouts can they find you?
So you can go to my website, zannilouise.com, and I've got a contact form on there. So send me an email and I'm very happy to ask any of your questions. And like I said, you can download some resources from my website as well, which go in addition to the book. So they go alongside the books.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zanni. Take care, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity for another chat again in the future. Take care.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Rachel.
Bye.